Good afternoon and welcome to the Pensions Regulators webinar on pensions dashboards. My name is Lucy Stone. I am joined by three excellent guests today. Chris Curry from the Pensions Dashboard Programme at MAPS, the Money and Pensions Service, who is going to talk to us about the progress being made in building the architecture that sits behind dashboards and user testing. Professional trustee Kelly Newton from Vidette, who will share with us some lessons from the schemes which are already connected, which may be useful for those who are still on the journey. And finally, Maurice Titley from the Pensions Administration Standards Association, who will talk to us about what you can already do to ensure your members have a positive experience when they use a dashboard. You can ask questions anytime during the session by using the box to the right of the video player. You can also download a reference document and a useful link guide during or after the webinar, and a recording will be available in a few days if you want to watch this again. We would ask you to please complete a short survey you can access through the menu on the left, even if you leave early. Let's take a step back and remind ourselves of what pensions dashboards are about. Pensions dashboards are online tools which will allow a saver to see all their pensions in one place at a time of their choosing, whether on a computer or a mobile phone. The first dashboard will be provided by the Money and Pensions Service, the Money Helper dashboard. In time, other private sector organisations will also be able to provide dashboards. At its core, the purpose of dashboards is to empower savers by ensuring they have access to accurate information so they can better plan for retirement. Dashboards will also help savers reconnect with pensions they'd forgotten about. There's both a need and demand for dashboards. A recent DWP survey showed that 80% of people would use a dashboard. Let's turn to our panel now. Chris, could you please provide an update on where we are in terms of delivering the architecture that sits behind dashboards, what we've learned from the journey so far, and what's next on the horizon?
Thank you, Lucy. I'm very happy to report that we have made significant progress so far, although there remains a lot still that has to be done. So on the Pensions Dashboard Programme, we've developed the central digital architecture, and we started to connect pension providers and schemes in April of this year. In order to do that, we've been working very closely with around 20 different organisations, and those are the ones who are directly connecting to the dashboard's ecosystem. So through their own records and those of the pension providers and schemes that they are connecting, these represent the vast majority of the 3,000 or so organisations in scope for pensions dashboards. 16 of these industry participants have now completed their connection journey, and 18 have passed the really important step of integration testing. And I'm also delighted to tell you that the state pensions are also connected into the ecosystem. And alongside the regulators, we're working very hard to make sure that these organisations are connected as soon as possible. But as of last month, we now have 60 million records connected to the ecosystem. That's 3/4 of the total that need to be connected by the end of October next year, and alongside tens of millions of state pension records. As a result of this, we remain confident that all pension providers and schemes in scope will be able to connect before the legal deadline of the 31st of October 2026. And this is testament to the hard work of everyone involved, including many of you in the industry who've been working very hard to make sure that connection to the Pensions Dashboard Programme remains very much on course. But alongside the work we're doing on connections, we're also developing the Money Helper Pensions Dashboard. This is the state-provided dashboard and the one that's going to be made first available to users. And I'll say a little bit more shortly about how we're testing the dashboard and developing it as we go forward. But we have been starting to share videos which show how the dashboard will look to users. And at this stage, we're sharing it very much around the industry. So if you are interested in seeing that, please do let us know. Alongside the Money Helper Pensions Dashboard, though, the government has made clear that it remains very committed to the principle of providing private sector dashboards as well. So we've been working very closely with potential dashboard providers, the Department for Work and Pensions and the regulators on developing a pathway for the implementation of private sector dashboards. We held a series of sessions with industry earlier this year, and we're currently working on consolidating that feedback and those insights, and we hope to share those findings and arranging more engagements in due course. Now, the final date for when both the Money Helper Pensions Dashboard and then subsequently private sector dashboards will be made available will be informed by a range of different factors, including whether the service is safe, secure and reliable, and we'll be monitoring the situation alongside the department and the regulators as well. Our next progress update report is due to be published shortly, so if you would like any further information, please do look out for that.
So we've seen how the dashboard programme has progressed and what's still ahead. Now let's turn to what schemes need to do to get dashboards ready. First of all, it's critical to understand that trustees and scheme managers are accountable for meeting their dashboard duties. So they need to take an active role in preparations and make dashboards a standing item on trustee agendas to ensure ongoing oversight. You should also stay alert to communications. Keep an eye out for updates from TPR, including on our guidance. And we also provide a handy checklist which you can use to stay aligned with our expectations and monitor your progress. The second key point is that engagement early is essential. Aligning with those who are supporting you, third-party administrators, integrated service providers, AVC providers, to avoid delays and ensure a coordinated approach. And finally, dashboards don't end with connection. Dashboards will only work for savers if schemes return the right information to the right person, and that starts with having good data. The importance of data quality is not new, but it's now urgent. Dashboards will make the consequence of poor data more visible. We know from our engagement that schemes are preparing their data, but there's still a lot of work to be done. We know that the depth of scrutiny and improvement actions varies in robustness, and we've published updated guidance on scheme member data quality to help trustees and scheme managers improve the way they manage data. Dashboards are pushing schemes to look at data, but good data has wider benefits than just meeting your dashboard duties. Good data supports automation, improves member experience, and gets you ready for things like buyout or consolidation. So make sure you look at your data for dashboards, but then maintain this focus on an ongoing basis. We also know from our engagement that a lot of work has been done on the data needed to find dashboard users in records, match data. But there has been less focus on ensuring the information you send back to your members on the value of their pensions is digitally available, recent and accurate. This needs to be an equal focus to matching data for trustees. Data is a key focus for TPR. We recently completed an initiative reaching out to hundreds of schemes who had no or low data scores, and we are now working with the largest schemes to understand their preparations. You can expect this focus to continue. We know that you won't have perfect data instantly. What matters is that trustees can demonstrate active governance, a clear delivery plan, and measurable progress. Now that I've set out our expectations as a regulator, I'm going to ask Kelly about what this means in practice, and in particular, any lessons from those who have connected, which can be useful to those who are still preparing for their duties. First of all, what are the key governance and planning steps that you've seen from your work with larger schemes that are important for the schemes yet to connect to focus on?
Thanks, Lucy. I think it's really important for the trustee to assign responsibility early on in this project. They need to decide, will it be the whole trustee that looks after the Connections project, or will it be a subcommittee, for example, a Benefits and Administration Committee? Then they need to decide what level of training that committee or trustee needs. There are some new terminology, ISP, there's some connection terminology that needs to be introduced to make sure that trustees understand the project and understand ultimately what's going to be happening with member data. A really important part is knowing what role your providers play in this, particularly your administrator. So you should understand what their role is, and you should review any contractual arrangements you have in place. You should agree who will take on which role and responsibility for connection, and what trustee protections are in place, and if there are any limitations to the liability between you and your provider. Alongside that discussion with your administrator, there are budget and fee discussions to be had. Really important to understand what's a one-off fee for connection initially, and actually what's an ongoing fee. This is not a piece of work that will disappear. It will be an ongoing commitment for trustees and schemes going forward. So really important to understand what the ongoing costs are. You might want to break that down between the the administrator and the ISP, but it's really good just to understand what the makeup of those costs are. And finally, understanding and updating where necessary any documentation that the scheme has to have. So data privacy notices should be updated to reflect any new third parties, and also data privacy impact assessments should be carried out so that trustees understand the new or emerging risks to their data alongside the work that they carry out for connection.
So you've brought us onto data very nicely. And so from a data and operational perspective, what are the sort of practical steps that schemes have been taking to ensure they were ready for dashboards compliance in your experience?
So it's about trustees knowing the quality of their data. It's not acceptable just to know that data exists and is there and is present. It's about the accuracy of that data. So trustees need to embark and work with their administrators to improve data accuracy where it's not as accurate as it could be. They should understand frequency of updates, how often things are being reviewed and to what level and to what extent, and if there are any exclusions to that. There's also other data aspects to consider. So for example, if you have a third-party AVC provider, it's really important to understand how that data interlinks with your core scheme data for this project. Also thinking about member experience, understand what members ultimately see when they log on to dashboards for the first time, what members will receive instant results versus the population of members who might need to wait a little bit for a calculation perhaps to be carried out within the administration team, and understanding member expectations and how we can manage those. Not all members will see the information they expect to see first time, so there will be queries, and it's about understanding whether those queries will come into the administration business as usual team, will they go through a triage, a specialist dashboards team, or actually will the trustees end up getting some queries from members? Really important to understand how those queries should be handled. And finally, I think on communications, it's important to tell members what they might see when dashboards go live and how that interacts with any member scheme websites you already have in place. You might want to do that in the form of a newsletter or a special communication or a note on your scheme website.
So Maurice is going to talk to us in a second about how you can prepare for member contacts and communications. But before we get there, do you have any final top tips for our audience? So anything else that trustees should be thinking about?
Yes, so really important to make sure that TPR Exchange contact details are up to date. Go in, log on, have a look, see whose email address and name is associated to your scheme, because that'll be the person that receives the registration code. Really important that the registration code is sent to your administrator if they are the one actually fulfilling the connection requirement for you. Remember that trustees remain accountable, so you should also get written confirmation back from your administrator that they have connected, and it might be some information from your ISP in there as well. All of that information then should form part of your record keeping and your audit trail. So that should also encompass things like trustee decision making, any data cleanse work that you've carried out, any discussions around matching criteria. And all of those things should be collected and recorded in a way that trustees can fulfil their governance requirements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing to consider is project conflicts. So you may well have other things pulling on your resource at the moment. You may have other data cleanse activities going on, potentially benefit rectification exercises, or you might be working towards a buy-in or even a buy-out at this time. So again, important to think about the interdependencies of those projects and how they all link together. And I think finally, reviewing your governance documentation to make sure that any new activities, any new third parties that you are working with are reflected within things like your incident response plan and your business continuity plan, to make sure that that governance framework is robust for the new world that we operate in with dashboards.
So we've heard how early engagement and practical experience have helped schemes successfully connect. But how do we ensure the dashboards work for savers in real life? That's where user testing comes in. Let's explore how the programme is validating the dashboard's experience and what insights are emerging from this process. Chris?
Thank you, Lucy. Testing is crucial to demonstrate that the end-to-end user experience of the service is positive, safe, and that the service meets user needs. So our user research and testing with prototypes has already informed and will continue to inform the ongoing design and development of the dashboard service. And it's also crucial to provide assurance that the standards that go alongside dashboards are fit for purpose. Before we started consumer testing, we did conduct some industry expert testing, and I was really fortunate to be able to take part in that testing. As you can imagine, it was really exciting to be able to see my own pensions on the pensions dashboard after so many years of working on the programme. And it's really a culmination of years of effort by so many people to get to this stage. But the Money and Pension Service has now begun consumer testing on the Money Helper Pensions dashboard, starting off initially with relatively low volumes in the first phase, which we are probably about halfway through at the moment. So this involves moderated and unmoderated testing with people who have been recruited from workplace pension schemes, the staff members and research panel members, so people who know a little bit about pensions. The second phase, which we're looking to move into in 2026, will see a gradual increase in volumes, eventually leading to thousands of individuals testing on the Money Helper Pensions dashboard. Participants here will be recruited to a panel from customer bases of pension providers and schemes, as well as other places such as charities and specialist recruiters, to make sure that we get a wide range of participants and can understand how dashboards will work for all different parts of society.
For anyone who's been working on dashboards for a long time, it's really exciting to see that we're now into user testing. But the user experience isn't just about how the user interacts with the dashboard, it's also about how schemes respond to the queries they get after someone uses a dashboard. So Maurice, can you tell us a little bit about what schemes can do now to prepare their systems, people and processes for the queries they will get when dashboards go live?
Thank you, Lucy. As Chris has said, the Money Helper dashboard is already live as part of the consumer testing phase, and usage is going to increase through 2026. So it's important to think not just about connecting, but also what life will be like as some of your members start using the dashboard. As Lucy said, you need to engage early with support partners, whether TPAs, ISPs or AVC providers, to understand resource needs and avoid delays. Some key questions for those providers: which parties will your members be directed to when they have queries? What channels will they be using, including click-throughs from the dashboard itself, phone calls, emails, and other channels? In particular, you need to understand, document, and agree the end-to-end post-dashboard usage support model. Let's unpack this a bit with some examples. Some of your first saver contacts will likely be resolving possible matches. These are where the individual using dashboards has very similar personal details to one of your members, but not quite close enough for you to be sure. They will have been asked to contact the scheme on the dashboard. The initial channel may be a click-through leading to a landing page, which may encourage self-service actions such as actually providing their national insurance number if they didn't first time around. If this does not resolve the match, then the administrator needs to assess the case. How are you going to work through whether they are or are not your member? This is a subtly different scenario to someone claiming a benefit, as the dashboard has directed the saver to make contact. You will still want to verify they are who they say they are, but then understanding what test led to them getting the possible response. For example, it might be they matched on first name, surname, and date of birth. Also understanding what did not match. Was there any comparison done on national insurance number? Or was it not provided by the saver or not held by the scheme? If the first few of these cases all result in you concluding that they were not your member after all, do you need to refine the test that you used to flag them as a possible match in the first place? PAS's data matching guidance recommends approaches for designing possible match tests that are focused and unlikely to invite too many savers to make contact who prove to not be your members. When you get actual matches, meaning it is your member using the dashboard, when you actually make a match, you need to provide pensions information, including accrued benefits and estimated retirement income. As Kelly was discussing, are you able to provide those pension values immediately to the Money Helper Pensions dashboard for all your members, which usually means they will have been pre-calculated? Pre-calculated values must be from a statement provided in the last 13 months, or a value calculated in the last 12 months. Where you don't have pension values you can provide immediately, will your administrators monitor the regulatory requirements to make the data available within 3 or 10 working days? The clock starts when the pension is first registered after it is matched, or again after every subsequent request by the saver to view their pension. Where there are multiple administrators connecting data on behalf of trustees, such as where AVC providers connect directly, then all monitoring of pension values provision needs to be consolidated for the trustees to look at as a whole. Do your administrators have the processes in place to calculate the missing values data within 3 or 10 days and make them available ready for when your member goes back to the dashboard? As consumer testing volumes increase and the Money Helper dashboard public launch is approaching, you'll want to be monitoring all channel post-dashboard usage traffic to analyse dashboard-triggered queries to assess member impact, and also to help us all understand what savers do next and how to improve the effectiveness and value of dashboards. Also, you'll want to develop clear, accessible messaging to prepare your members for Money Helper launch, set expectations, and provide support channels. PASA guidance is there to help with all this. Guidance on matching approaches, calculation of pension values, and our extensive dashboards toolkit content, which we are adding to continually as the industry gains real experience of handling dashboard requests. One of our next outputs will be guidance on compliance monitoring to help trustees and their administrators build the necessary processes to track all the key information and build in regular reviews of areas such as matching approaches.
We've packed a lot into the last half hour, from the progress being made on the architecture and user testing, to the regulators' expectations and practical tips for trustees to prepare. There's clearly a lot to do, and with the legislative deadline less than 11 months away, it's clear to me that collaboration is imperative to ensure that savers can benefit from this transformational opportunity. Trustees working with their administrators and service providers, industry working with the Money and Pension Service, and the regulators. We're going to take a short break now before Chris Morris and I dive into your questions. I'm going to dive right in if that's all right. I am going to start. The first question is around whether there is going to be guidance on what is a fair cost to implement dashboards. So I'm going to take that one. I think it's really important to understand when you're trustees what are the costs you're being quoted, because we know people are being quoted different numbers, but it's often partly down to what the scheme situation is like. So how much of the data is already digitised, how much needs to be revalued, especially deferred member values. So when you're a trustee and you're looking at costs, sort of think about what is that cost quote telling you? Is it telling you what the ongoing cost is going to be, or is it just a connection cost? Does it cover data improvement? There'll obviously be some companies you can use to try and compare costs, but really it's about understanding what their costs are and talking to the administrator. And sometimes there are areas where you can negotiate, so maybe automating a little less upfront as long as you can revalue on demand. So my advice would be just make sure that you really understand the costs you're being quoted, and you understand what's ongoing, BAU, etc. I'm going to move straight on to a question for someone else. So Morris, we've had a question about what is the benefit of connecting now as opposed to by the deadline and participating in testing?
So I think that the benefit lies in the fact that there are a lot of schemes connecting in 2026. I think by the original plans, about 2/3 of schemes were in 26 in that first 3 quarters of the year. You also have the legal deadline that everyone will be familiar with, the October 2026 deadline in law for connection. So that means that everyone's going to be very, very busy next year. Third-party administrators will have their plans. They'll know who they're connecting and when they're connecting. So sticking with a guidance connection date to get yourself connected at your allotted point, I think is more important than ever next year. And also it does mean that you'll be in a position to benefit from some of those early requests that you'll get and start to have a look at what it's like to perhaps make a match even, and then maybe respond with some view data as well. So I think getting that early sort of feeling as to what it's like to receive dashboard requests in reality will be really useful as well.
While I'm testing, I'll go to Chris. We've had a question from Angela about whether trustees and the industry can receive regular updates on testing progress?
That's a very good question, and it's really important that actually industry does receive those detailed updates. It's certainly part of our plans to do that. And the reason for that is because it's not just helping us understand how the architecture is working and how the Money Helper Pensions Dashboard is working, but it's really important that industry understands what's happening with their members as well, and to help them get ready for what will follow once people have used a pensions dashboard. So Maurice has mentioned about how testing is going to help people get their own processes in place, help make sure that they're providing the right data in the right way, and that comes through appropriately. But also it's really important for the success of dashboards overall that the industry is well prepared for what happens when a member looks at their information on a dashboard and then decides they need to do something else. So maybe contact their provider to find out more information or to find out what they can do next. So we need to make sure that everything that we're learning through testing, and that could be not just about how people are using the dashboard, but what they plan to do afterwards, can be shared with the industry so they can get ready for what they need to do in the next part of the journey when people move on from dashboards. So we will certainly be making sure that we are sharing information, sometimes through webinars, sometimes through our frequently asked questions, or through the newsletter that we have, or maybe other publications as well, to make sure that everybody's aware of what's happening.
Yeah, and just to reassure you, we will be supporting the Money and Pension Service in sharing this information to schemes, so through our channels such as Regulatory Roundup. I'm going to move to a more detailed question, still from Angela, about AVC providers and how they can be encouraged to give trustees the information needed in a standardised format. So before we delve in, can you talk, Maurice, before you delve in, can you please talk about the different ways that AVC providers are providing information and then what that means for the standardised format?
Yes, of course. So AVC providers can either connect directly to dashboards, or they can provide information to scheme administrators, so the scheme administrator can load that information through their dashboard connection themselves. I think when it comes to receiving that information from AVC providers, it would be useful if the formats were standardised. There isn't a huge amount of different data items in a set of data from an AVC provider, and what's really important, I think, is to spend that time up front to get your first example file across, understand what you're receiving, understand who you're receiving it for. PASA has produced some guidance for both the scenarios there where trustees, administrators are connecting themselves, but also where the AVC providers are connecting directly. And there's a whole set of checklist items that trustees and administrators can go through to say, right, are we well prepared for this? So I think if you carry out the preparation, you should be in a good place. Over time, maybe they will become more standardised, and I agree that would be a helpful thing in itself as well.
And again, this highlights the importance of early engagement with your AVC providers and really understanding how it's going to work, which route is going to be used and what data is. And the other thing we're seeing schemes doing is talking to the AVC providers about the match data, the data they're going to use to find savers in record, and making sure that is consistent across the main administrator and the AVC provider. I'm going to, still on the subject of consistency. So is there a risk that schemes might be interpreting dashboard requirements differently? I'm going to go to Maurice, I think, for that one.
So I think there is. There are some flexibilities in the data standards in certain areas. So one example is around the provision of pension value data and what you do in the exceptional circumstances. So where the value data isn't there for a particular member, or there's other warnings that you want to provide. There is some choice as to what gets provided. I think consistency would be great, and PASA has put together some guidance that was released earlier this year, which we did in conjunction with PDP and also with the Money Helper team who are developing the Money Helper dashboard, to say, right, this is probably the best code that you could use in a particular circumstance. So I think that guidance is useful for schemes to look at, and it will of course evolve over time, because once Money Helper is fully fledged and showing all the different types of benefits, then we will have answered some of these other questions as to exactly which code would make sense in which situation.
Yeah. Chris, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this is actually one of the real benefits we're finding of the testing that we've been doing, is that we are learning all the time about the way in which different schemes might be using that flexibility and interpreting some things slightly differently, and so returning things in a slightly different way. So it's really important that we can look through that and to overcome those issues during testing, and maybe at some point that will feed into either updated standards or an updated guidance around the standards to make sure we're getting that consistency coming through. But it's one of the real benefits of testing that we're seeing this happen now.
Yeah.
So by the time we get members of the public looking at that information, they should see a consistent view.
That's great. We've got another question on costs from Richard around, again, the proportionality of costs for smaller schemes, for example, and how much they're being quoted to connect, and whether this is coming out higher than perhaps what the NAO and DWP had initially assessed. I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier about really understanding what those costs you're being quoted for are. Is this just connection? Is it an ongoing cost? Is it one-off costs? Does it include other work such as data cleaning or automation that is needed to connect to dashboards? And of course, anything that involves data cleaning, it's really important to think of it as, yes, it's a cost, but it's also an investment, because having good data supports you with lots of other areas, for example, preparing for buyout, being the classic example for DB scheme. I'm going to go to Chris for this one, a bit of a tricky question.
Okay.
Do we think, are we expecting there might be any further delays given the kind of experience that some of the connectors were connecting maybe later than originally anticipated, and the technical issues that there have been to date?
Yeah, so I don't think so. I think that the technical issues we're finding are the purpose of testing. This is why we're doing this, is to uncover and flush out some of those things that when we're connecting 3,000 schemes through 20 odd different connection points, you know there's going to be some differences and things we need to iron out and identify as we go through that. So that's an important part of what we're doing at the moment. What we're finding is generally minor technical issues. There's nothing that's been major that's been uncovered with what we're doing, so there's nothing there that would lead us to suggest that we're not going to be able to work to the only deadline we have at the moment, which is the regulatory deadline of the 31st of October 2026. As I mentioned, the industry participants we've been working with over a period of time have either completed connection or are very close to completing connection in every case that we've been working with so far. So there's no reason at all why they won't be able to connect schemes by that regulatory deadline. So in that respect, I can't see there is any real reason for there to be any delay, and certainly I can't see there be any change in the regulations or the guidance around that.
And again, one of the important things is that it all works. So how secure is the system, and how will it work if there are any cyber incidents? How would that work? How would it be reported to whom? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, so security, cyber and otherwise of the system is really important, and in fact we've had the design of the system done in such a way that it's as secure as it could possibly be. So there is no centralized data lake, there is no big target for hackers to look at. The data only resides where it currently resides, and then temporarily on a dashboard when individuals are looking at it. So we don't store it anywhere else. We are following very closely the standard set by the National Centre for Cybersecurity, and all those organisations connecting to the infrastructure and the central digital architecture itself has to go through IT health checks and penetration testing to make sure that before we even start transferring information around, that these tests have been adhered to and met as much as possible. That's not to say that it's always going to be foolproof. We know that there's always instances, and that's why we will be continually and consistently looking at what best practice is and making sure that through, for example, updated standards on a regular basis, we can make sure that the system is as secure as we can make it at that particular point in time. There will be kind of an ongoing service that's being set up. We're still working at how that's going to work in the longer term and who's going to be running the kind of business as usual model as we go through. But you can rest assured that cybersecurity will be a key component of anything that's done in running the service over a long period of time.
And I think it's important to know as well that the existing requirements to report, for example, in GDPR or other data protection legislation do apply here.
Absolutely.
So if there's a loss of consumer data, the same rules apply in terms of notifying the Information Commissioner's Office or indeed members if they're potentially affected. So that framework is still in place. A question that is for me this time about fines. So what will be the fines for schemes that are required to be dashboard ready and do not connect, and how often will we apply them? Is it a month not connected? So we published earlier in the year our final compliance and enforcement policy, and we are committed to being pragmatic. We recognise this is a significant endeavour for industry, But what we really want to focus on is sort of willful or reckless non-compliance. So there will be circumstances where a scheme can't comply with all aspects of the regulation, but if there is a clear audit trail of why, and they can evidence that they have, done best endeavours and they've worked with their administrator and the ISP and they sought to resolve issues. The other element we'll be looking at as well is the impact on members. How many members are affected. That will be also relevant to whether the dashboards are live or if it's just users. So you can find out more about our approach to compliance in our compliance and enforcement policy, which is on our website and linked through from our dashboard guidance. But in terms of the actual value of fines, it is up to £5,000 for an individual and £50,000 per breach for a non-individual, so a company. But again, you can find out more about our compliance and enforcement policy and our penalties policy. The next question is from Janet, who has a small pension fund with two people who are both trustees and based in the same address. And how is the dashboard going to be useful for them, other than another layer of admin? Well, good news, Janet. If you only have two members, you are not currently in scope for pensions dashboards. It's only schemes with 100 or more active and deferred members that are currently in scope. So there is no requirement for you at this time to connect. However, you can, if you so choose, connect on a voluntary basis. Chris, do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the connection on a voluntary basis is something we're looking at the moment to understand how that might work. We can understand that some schemes might not want to do that, but there are a number out there who are keen to participate because they see the benefit for members. And I think in this case, that the benefit, you might know very well about what is happening in that particular scheme, but if you're a member of other schemes, if you're entitled to a state pension, all of that information will then be seen alongside that information that you have on that scheme as well. So it's not just about what you can show from your scheme, but how that is combined with all the other sources of information and all the other pensions that members might have.
Thank you. Another question for you, Chris, thank you, is have you had any feedback from individuals that have already used the dashboards? And is it positive? No bias, because you have used the dashboards and obviously you are fervent.
Absolutely. I can talk about my own experience, and I think it was very positive for a number of different reasons. But one of them was, so I was actually very pleasantly surprised at how quick and responsive the dashboard was. It didn't take long for the information to come through. So as I mentioned earlier, we're currently still in the first round of user testing as we're going through, and we're currently collating the feedback and the analysis of that, which we'll be sharing hopefully relatively soon with the industry to help do that. But I think it's fair to say we haven't found anything major. There are good points. There are some points that I think that people are pointing out that need a little bit of improvement. But again, that's the whole point of doing the testing now. We want to iron out these issues before we get into the next phase of higher volume testing, and then ultimately before it's launched.
Yeah. And you heard earlier on, talking from the perspective of schemes who have already connected, Kelly gave a few examples as well. So you can hear, if you go back to that part of the webinar, you can hear about the experience of a scheme that's connected to dashboards. The next question is from David, and this is around the fact that there's a reliance on employers sometimes to provide information to administrators. And if there's only 3 or 10 days to calculate a value because it's not available, what happens if the employer is late providing information or if they're non-compliant? So I think, David, for this example, I would say this is where it's important to keep a robust audit trail. And I'll go back to the point that we are pragmatic. It would be a breach to not return the information within 10 days. But again, we are pragmatic. We look at the circumstances of every case, what is the saver impact and what the trustees have sought to do to resolve the issues. Ultimately, if needed, we do have what's called third-party compliance powers. So we can intervene where it's a third party that's caused a trustee to fail to comply. But I think the importance is to maintain a good audit trail, but also already work with the employers now so they understand now what might be coming their way for how many members. It won't be all members that you have to calculate within 10 days or that you need information from the employer, but you can try and get ahead of these scenarios by working with the administrator. A question now, I'm not sure who's best placed to take this one. I can always answer it if no one else jumps in. But why is a national insurance number not a compulsory input for the person using a dashboard? I think the concern there is obviously a lot of schemes use this as a bit of a unique identifier. So Chris, can you tell us why it's not a mandatory field?
So the mandatory fields are generally those that are used for the digital identification and the verification of an individual. And as part of that, at the moment, there is no way to verify a national insurance number, so it's not part of that verification process in going through. Having said that, the design of the Money Helper dashboard as it is at the moment is providing a very, very strong nudge to individuals to provide that national insurance number and making clear that they're much more likely to find their pensions if that national insurance number is entered as well. One other reason why it's not necessarily compulsory is we know there are some people who don't know the national insurance number and aren't aware of it, so we don't want to exclude people who don't know their national insurance number from using a pensions dashboard as well. But even there, we're providing information and guidance and pointing them towards a service that can help them find their national insurance number. So we're looking at how we can try and make it, even if it's not mandatory, used as widely as possible, because we are aware of how important it is for that matching process.
And so far in testing, what's your experience? Are people providing it, or do we think it's going to be a real problem?
So the testing we've done so far is probably not as representative as it could be, because we're starting, as we mentioned earlier, with people who are working in a pension provider environment, so they're much more likely to know their national insurance number and much more likely to put it in. I think this is something we'll be looking at very closely when we get into the wider testing, and certainly when we're testing at scale, to just see, firstly, how many people do put it in and how well that nudge is working, but also what the difference is in results that come through, depending whether or not people put in that national insurance number.
Okay, great, thank you. A question for Maurice. If a scheme has the accrued pension and the estimated retirement income, so the projection available and for members, is there anything else that a member can request that will have to be provided within the 3 to 10 day deadline?
So the 3 to 10 day deadline does relate to the provision of accrued benefits and ERI, but it also effectively encompasses everything else that's there in terms of other view data items as well. But the 3 to 10 day specifically is around those two data items. So you would expect to have a response in other aspects of view data coming through immediately, even if the actual pension values are not available. The other thing to say about that is the 3 to 10 day deadline comes into play often because there isn't an existing value that's available. So there isn't one that's from a statement provided in the last 13 months or a value calculated in the last 12 months. So there will be situations, I suspect, in the future when the latest value that was provided has gone out of date, and hence the 3 to 10 day kicks in again. But the other information should come quicker. I mean, that's the idea of it. That only applies to that area.
So there should not be any unforeseen surprises if your accrued pension and ERI is available and recent. There shouldn't be anything else that comes to catch you out. That's good to know. Chris, a question from Brian about how are you guaranteeing the security of users of the dashboard?
Well, guarantee is a strong word.
Yes.
I think, but as I mentioned earlier, around the cybersecurity aspects, it's something we take very seriously. Now, security can mean a number of different things, so I won't go over the cyber aspects again, but I think the fact that we are ensuring that an individual is the only person who can access their data, so you have to go through the digital identification process and verification in order to access that data, is important. But also the kind of what information we're showing on a dashboard is really important as well. So as well as the numbers, there's also a lot of extra guidance and support on there. So signposting to where people can go to get further help, where they can contact their provider, for example. And importantly, things like telling people what they shouldn't be doing. So they shouldn't be relying on the information solely for making any financial decisions, and in particular some scam warnings to make sure that people aren't at risk from being encouraged to use a dashboard and provide that information to someone else in terms of doing that. Also in terms of any downloads that come from the dashboard, the FCA rules mean that those warnings will have to be part of those downloads as well. Yeah. So it's not something that people can forget. We're going to make sure that people are very aware of what the limitations of dashboard use is, but also to try and help them make the right decisions about where they go and what they do next and keep them as safe as possible.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got a question from Mark, which is for me, around what is TPR's interpretation of accuracy in the context of data? That is an excellent question. So our expectation is that data is of high quality. We often talk about present and accurate. In fact, of our recently updated guidance, we take a step further and we refer to the 6 dimensions of data quality which government uses, which include consistency, validity, timeliness, and others. But I think the point is you need to be confident this data is right and fair. So if you're talking about value data, are you confident in the accuracy of your calculations? Are you confident in the accuracy of your inputs? So for example, that contributions have been properly reflected in the pot, the investment returns have been properly reflected in the pot. So it's what we don't want is people just think there's something in the field, it's fine. It's not about presence. Obviously, we know you can't check every data all the time, but there are lots of rules you can use around, is it consistent with other fields? So for example, is date of joining after date of birth and those basic things. There are some examples in our guidance. There's also examples in guidance on data quality that PASA produced a few years ago. I hope that answers your question, but I would refer you to the guidance on data quality, which we've just updated, in fact, and has a lot more about what our expectations are. So then we have a question from Rachel, who says, probably has quite a few pensions, and what happens if people have changed names for a variety of reasons? How does that work with the sort of matching process? I think I'll go to Maurice for that one. Can you explain quickly as well, remind people about the difference between a full match and a possible match as well? I think that's probably helpful.
Yes, so a full match is when you've met the bar to think, right, we are going to release the view response for this member. We are confident enough that this is indeed the member in the scheme. A possible match is when you haven't quite met that bar and you want to invite the individual to make contact with you to try and resolve the situation. So looking at this specific question, so if you're looking at a situation where the names of an individual has changed over time, or the address has changed over time, or what have you, that could leave you in a possible match situation. Now, at the moment, the way the find service works is you don't have the facility to enter alternative names that you might have been known by in the past, or nicknames, or old versions of your surname. But that is something that's going to be added in.
It will be added at some point
in the future. So when that is, you'll then have that ability to submit that information into the find request, which might give it a better chance of matching up with what you find on the actual pension records. But there's nothing stopping pension schemes already sort of asking their members, are you known by a different name, and potentially even holding that in a field and using that as part of the matching process, maybe to lead to a possible match if that nickname, if you like, matches the request that's coming in, or the formal name matches the request that's coming in. So there are things that are open to be done at the moment, but there'll be more options when, as Chris says, those alternative values get added in.
Yeah. So, but in a sense, also this possible match whole process is quite helpful for those people, because they can then know which provider they haven't told about the change in surname, pick up the phone, give the additional detail. It will do a possible match, but you've also done you've done what you're meant to do and told your provider. So the next question is for Chris. At which point do you expect there'll be a meaningful estimate of volumes and timings of member contact to support schemes and administrators in getting ready for the launch of dashboards?
Yeah, so again, that's a really important aspect of how we're working towards dashboards working for everybody. So again, it's going to be one of the things that we are testing and looking for as we go through the user testing and further user research throughout the first part of next year. We've had some broad estimations of volumes, which we've looked at in the past, based on what's happened overseas and what we've had from other surveys that we've gone out with so far. We think they're likely to be quite popular, but it also depends on how we launch and how we do it. So we don't have kind of any definitive estimates at the moment. It's something that we'll be building up as we get more and more information from the testing and understanding how many people are using it and for what purposes as we go through that, how easy or otherwise it is to recruit people to the panels, for example.
Yeah.
I don't imagine we'll have much difficulty, but you never know how it's going to work. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that as we get that information, we continue to share it with industry so that there's no surprises and so that by the time the Secretary of State makes that announcement that the Money Helper dashboard will be available in 6 months' time, that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. Everyone's expecting that because they know what's been happening, and enough information has come out of the programme for them to be quite confident that we're at that stage.
Okay, great. Maurice, do you have anything to add from an administration perspective?
Not particularly. I think it's going to be really interesting to see when that final launch period is coming up. How many sort of cases have actually already gone through by that point? How much volume experience has been available, and what sort of leads to the decision to say, right, we are comfortable now that we can actually sound the klaxon, if you like, and say that you've got a 6-month period to prepare for that launch. So I think looking at that evidence base and getting that confidence, that's going to be a great moment for dashboards when we know we've actually reached that point.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is from John, who is anticipating that the scheme will have completed a buy-in contract by the end of 2026, prior to wind up, and the deadline is in October 26, and whether there's sort of a cost with little benefit to the members, as the buy-in will be in place before members can use a dashboard. So I want to make a distinction here between buy-in and buy-out. If the scheme is bought in, it remains the accountability of the trustees. So those trustees still need to prepare information for dashboards and provide information for dashboards. There is no, the duties do not fall away. When it comes to buyout, once the scheme has bought out and there are no relevant members left in the scheme, so no active and deferred members, then there are no more responsibilities on the trustees, and instead it's the buyout provider who has assumed the responsibilities for those members. So there is a distinction that's very important here. If you're really talking about buy-in, then you still have the responsibilities. If you're talking about buyout, once the scheme is bought out fully, then the responsibilities cease. It's a little bit tricky, obviously, if you're anticipating that those two are, one of these, the buyout's going to happen very close to the legislative deadline. And again, I would urge you to think about, making sure you've got a good audit trail and a good record of the progress you've made, how you've managed the risks, how you've assessed the risk to members, how the decisions were made, because then we will be looking into failure to connect by the deadline, and we'll have a conversation to understand kind of how did you get to that point, and to understand the member impact. The next question I'm going to ask is for Maurice, and it comes from John, and who notes that the current provision of data is obviously heavily linked to annual benefits statements, which are calculated typically on the 31st of March. And is there an expectation that this will be more current in the future, so people will want to see more frequent updates to the information?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. A lot of people might be aware of the regulatory requirement that when you actually provide an illustration, all the illustration dates should be the same across all sort of components of what you provide, and that sort of underlies the point that actually when you look at dashboards, there's been an expectation that savers will find it more easy to understand where an illustration date is consistent, but they will see lots of different illustration dates across their pensions. Now, if one of those pension providers is using a much more frequent update, because they can, often because that might be a DC provider who's able to do that, does that add a huge amount to the overall sort of response, if you like, because you'll be seeing the state pension projected at the point where it is. You might be seeing other providers who are doing it more annually. So I think there would obviously be a gain if everyone could produce it as a more up-to-date, but I think it might almost create unnecessary work for people to try and do that. If you can't do it, I think producing it annually and having it all sort of summed into a single figure is probably fine.
I think that's right for now, but I think it's important to realise as well that this is the first iteration of a pensions dashboard, and the way that we've always been introducing it is to try and introduce it in a way which is the least additional work for the industry to do. So we're using figures deliberately, which generally already exist. There's one or two exceptions where in DB schemes, for example, there are additional calculations to do, and now they need to be made available. But really, this is just kind of putting together a lot of information which generally can already be found, but just putting it in one place. Once this is in place, and one of the things we'll be testing with consumers is kind of, do they appreciate the differences in the dates? What does that mean to them? And I think even though kind of dashboards are very good at bringing the pensions industry, into the digital age, there's still quite a long way to go. And things like having a 3-day and 10-day response time is not really in line with most people's expectations of a digital experience. So I think over time we'd expect to see things like this evolve and to probably move to a situation where there's more automation, there's more immediate response, and certainly in the DC space where we're already seeing some providers are very happy to provide daily updates for what's happening in that space rather than relying on something that's on the benefit statement. So I think it's something which will continue to evolve.
And I think for those providers, there's also a question about, well, what happens if you see a value that's different on the dashboard than the benefit statement? So it's having to explain that. And obviously the providers who do effectively daily live things already have the mechanisms to explain this if the information on the portal is different to the benefit statements. So I'm going to ask Chris, we are 11 months away from the final connections.
Yep.
And so when do we think there might be an announcement about the launch of dashboards? Or when do we think dashboards will be launched?
Yeah, so we know that the Secretary of State, when they make an announcement, will give 6 months notice of when the dashboard is going to be launched. But there's a lot of information that we need to work out and process before then, because we also know that there are a number of key criteria that we think need to be in place before we think it's the right time to make dashboards accessible in that way. So one of the key ones is coverage, but we've already talked about how many pension scheme memberships we have connected. So 3/4 of the total we think are already connected, which is brilliant because it's really important that people can find their pensions. If they don't find things they expect to see, then we know it's generally a very disappointing experience for them and they tend not to want to come back, which would defeat the purpose of why we're having dashboards in the first place. But we also have touched on safety and security, and we need to make sure that dashboards are operating in a safe environment, that members feel secure in what they're doing. And the final one is we need to make sure that members have a positive experience. So they come out of using a pensions dashboard having more information and information they can understand and a clear idea of where they can go to do more. Not everyone is going to do more straight away, but we need them to feel comfortable with what they've seen and to kind of have got something from the experience that's positive in doing that. And we're only really going to understand all of that as we go through the user testing and to pull that through. So it's really important that we continue the testing over the next few months and into the first part of 2026. And I think we'll start to get more ideas as we go through then as to how close we are to meeting those criteria, and then when we're likely to be able to tell the Secretary of State it's the right time to make that announcement.
And the last question we'll take, it's from Mark about what can be done about certain AVC providers who are not cooperating with the trustees. So Maurice, you've already mentioned that you do guidance on AVC providers, including a checklist about how to engage them. So I think that would be the first step, early engagement and using the checklist. Ultimately, as I've already mentioned, I think it comes down to the audit trail and that we do have third-party powers if it's a third party that causes a trustee to fail to comply with their duties. But it's really important to do that early engagement. If you're struggling to get a contact detail, you can reach out to us. We do have contacts at the AVC providers. We are also talking to the AVC providers with the FCA to make sure they are preparing for dashboards, but keep that audit trail about what the issues are. And so if you do end up being non-compliant, we can consider that as part of our decision making. So we've covered a lot. From the build of the technical architecture and user testing and practical steps to take to prepare for dashboards, including launch. Before the end, I think it's really important to pause and to recognise the progress that's been made so far. The industry has really come a really long way, and there's been a lot of collaboration, a huge amount of commitment and a lot of innovation as well driving this change. But it's also important to remember what this is all for. So ultimately, we're building something that will be really useful for savers, something that will be a powerful tool and will give people clarity, control and confidence in their retirement savings and reunite them with lost spots. So your members, as trustees of pension schemes, your members will benefit from this transformational opportunity. But there are also benefits for industry, and the preparations for dashboards are yielding wider benefits. They're supporting schemes in streamlining operations, improving data quality and enhancing member engagement more generally. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panel and all of you for joining us today and submitting your questions. We hope you found the session interesting and informative, and you are now better equipped for your dashboards journey. As a reminder, you can download a reference document and a useful link guide, and a recording of the webinar will be accessible in a few days' time by navigating back to this page. Finally, we appreciate your feedback and would love to hear what you have to say. Please do take the time to submit your views on today's webinar by following the Survey tab on the left-hand side menu or using the QR code on your screen now. So for now, it's goodbye from all of us.